The shovel was almost too heavy for her arms, but she kept digging because the grown-ups were asleep in the cabin, and hunger was louder than fear. Snow clung to her braids, the cottonwood towering above her like a giant who kept secrets, its roots knuckled out of the ground as if begging her to hide something. She had found a small box in her father's shed, cracked on one side, nothing inside but space enough for scraps, so she filled it with what little she could. A crust of bread she couldn't bring herself to eat, a button from her mother's coat, and a scrap of paper on which she had scrawled in clumsy letters, "Please God, don't forget us." Her fingers trembled as she tucked it under the roots and pushed dirt back with her bare hands, whispering to no one, maybe to the tree, maybe to heaven. She never told her family. She never dug it up again. Life swept her forward. Her father dead by spring, her mother's eyes hollow with grief, her own years buried under work until the memory of the box felt like a fever, dream she wasn't sure had really happened. 20 years passed, and she became a woman the town pitied more than admired, a widow too young to be old, a mother trying to keep her daughter fed while the world shifted harder with every season. She thought the cottonwood had long since swallowed her childish prayer. Thought the roots had grown around it and crushed it into dust. But on a night when the wind pressed against her shutters and the lamp sputtered low, she heard boots on her porch. Measured steps, not hurried, not cruel, the sound of someone who had come with purpose. Her daughter slept upstairs, and she pressed her palm to the doorframe, her body trembling with the old fear that nothing good came at night. Yet when the knock came, it was soft, almost reverent, and when she pulled the door open, the cold rushed in, carrying the smell of leather and dust and something older still. He stood there, taller than memory, his shoulders broad beneath a coat gone ragged from travel, his hair streaked with silver though his face held the stubborn strength of youth that refused to die. In his hands he carried a wooden box, weathered and cracked in the same place, and though her mind told her it could not be, her heart knew before he spoke. He set it gently on the porch rail, as if it were something sacred, and his voice, low and rough, said only, "You buried this, it saved me." Her breath caught sharp, a sound more like a sob than a gasp, and her knees threatened to give. She looked at the box, at the man, at the snow curling against his boots, and words refused to come. For what could she say to a stranger who had pulled life out of the dirt she had left behind? He held her gaze, his eyes dark, steady, carrying years of silence and a weight she did not yet understand. Then he tipped his hat, turned as if to leave, and in that moment she realized the door she had opened might close on a truth she had waited her whole life without knowing. She reached for the box, her fingers brushing the cold wood, and whispered into the night. "Wait." The word left her lips like a plea, and he stopped at the edge of the porch, the night wrapping around his tall frame as though even the wind was waiting for what came next. And when he turned back, his eyes carried no anger at being halted, only the steady patience of someone who had lived with silence long enough to know the weight of a single word. She clutched the box against her chest, her pulse thundering, and asked how it had come to him after all these years, her voice breaking as if afraid the answer might undo her. He stepped closer, his boots creaking on the old boards, and said he had been a boy then, near starving, wandering the valley alone after fever took his kin. His body so hollow with hunger he could hear the echo of his own ribs when he breathed, and one night when snow bit his skin and the sky held no mercy, he stumbled beneath the cottonwood tree, ready to let the earth claim him. His voice roughened as he told her how he fell against the roots, half delirious, and his hand struck wood buried shallow, and when he pulled it free, inside was the crust of bread, small and stale, but enough to turn his death into another day of life, and enough to remind him that someone had prayed for him, even if they did not know his name. He told her he carried that box from camp to camp, through every hard season, a relic of salvation. A vow carved into his bones that if ever he found the one who had buried it, he would place it back in their hands. Her eyes blurred with tears, memory crashing through her because she had buried it in desperation, thinking no one would ever see. And yet here he stood, living proof that her childish plea had become his lifeline. She whispered that she had written only 3 words, her letters clumsy, not meant for anyone but God, and his lips curved faintly, a smile carved with sorrow, as he said those words had been enough to keep him walking, enough to remind him that life was worth holding. She staggered back a step, clutching the box tighter, and asked why he had waited until now. 20 years gone, and he said he had not known her name then, only the land, and he had carried the box with him until the day he saw her face in town, older but the same eyes, the same quiet strength, and he knew the prayer belonged to her. She trembled, torn between disbelief and the strange fire blooming in her chest, and her daughter stirred upstairs, the creak of floorboards like a reminder that the past had not only touched her but would ripple forward into the life she was raising. The cowboy's voice lowered, solemn, as he said he did not bring the box to claim her or demand thanks, but to keep his vow, to return what had never been his. And yet as he spoke, she felt the truth burning between them, that something had bound their lives since that night under the cottonwood, something deeper than time. She stepped into the lamplight, spilling from her doorway, her tears gleaming on her cheeks, and whispered that if the box had kept him alive, then perhaps she had been keeping herself alive too, waiting for this moment. And as his shadow fell across her porch, she realized 20 years had not been wasted but written for this night, when the man who found her buried plea had come to place it back in her hands. The box felt heavier now than it ever had beneath the cottonwood roots, and as she stood with it pressed to her chest, the weight of his words still ringing in her ears, the sound of her daughter's footsteps came down the stairs, light at first, and then quick, curious, and when the girl appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her gaze snapped awake the moment she saw the tall stranger standing on their porch. The girl's brows knit tight, her voice sharp with suspicion, as she asked her mother who he was and why he stood outside in the dark, and Nora's throat closed with the fear of how this truth would sound to someone who had never known anything but loss and hardship. The cowboy did not move, did not defend himself, only dipped his head with a calm respect, his voice even as he said he was returning something that had never belonged to him. The girl's eyes flicked to the box in her mother's arms, confusion darkening her expression, and she demanded to know what it was, why her mother clutched it like a holy thing. Nora tried to steady her breath, explaining in halting words that when she was a child, she had buried it beneath the cottonwood tree, that it had been nothing more than scraps and a prayer, but it had reached this man in the moment he needed it most. Her daughter stared in disbelief, then looked back at the cowboy with suspicion edged by fear, whispering that he could have stolen it, that he could be lying, and her words cut Nora because they carried the same mistrust she herself had lived with for years. The cowboy met the girl's sharpness without flinching, his voice steady as he said he had no reason to invent such a story, that his life carried scars enough to prove it, and he slowly rolled up his sleeve to reveal an arm marked by old burns and cuts, the body of a man who had endured hunger and battles, his survival written in his flesh. The girl's eyes softened for only a heartbeat, then hardened again, and she turned to her mother with trembling anger, asking why she had never told her about the box, about the prayer, about anything that had tied hope to their name. Nora's eyes filled, her words breaking as she admitted she had buried the memory as deeply as she had buried the box, ashamed of her childish desperation and fearful it meant nothing. until tonight when the truth returned to her porch in the hands of a man who had lived by it. The daughter's jaw quivered, torn between wanting to trust and wanting to guard the life they had built from disappointment. And she whispered that if his story was true, then fate had already chosen him for them. But if it was false, then he was only another man knocking at their fragile world. The cowboy stepped forward into the lamplight, his eyes steady on the girl, and said that he did not come to break their lives apart but to return what had bound them unknowingly for 2 decades, and whether she believed him or not, he would leave the box and walk away if that was what she wished. The girl froze, stunned by the quiet gravity of his words, and Nora's heart clenched as she realized the decision to let him in or send him away no longer belonged only to her, but to the family they had become together, and the porch grew silent with the weight of the choice waiting to be made. The night pressed in around them, the lamplight stretching long shadows across the porch, and the silence after his words cut sharper than any demand because he had left the decision hanging not in his hands, but in theirs. Nora's daughter stood frozen, her fists clenched at her sides, her young face caught between fear and defiance, and her voice cracked as she whispered that men always came with promises, but left with nothing but ashes. And if he truly meant to go, then he should go now before he broke what little peace they had. Nora flinched at her daughter's words, because she knew the bitterness in them was not from imagination, but from the wounds of years lived too hard. And yet something inside her rebelled at the thought of watching him walk away after he had carried her forgotten plea for 2 decades. She tightened her hold on the box, stepped between her daughter and the man, and said softly that not every knock on their door was meant to steal, that sometimes it was an answer long delayed. The cowboy's eyes softened as he looked at them both, and he said he would not argue with the girl's fear because it was deserved by the world they lived in, but he promised that if he stayed, it would be as one who protected, not one who demanded. The daughter's jaw trembled, her anger slipping into tears she tried to hide, and she asked why he had come now. Why not before? Why wait until their lives were already worn down by years of loneliness? He answered that he had searched, that fate had drawn him away and back again, that he had not known her mother's name until he saw her face one market day and recognized the same eyes from the night her prayer had saved him. And from that moment he knew the time for waiting was over. Nora stepped closer to him, her breath unsteady, and for the first time in years she felt the stir of hope stronger than grief, and she whispered that maybe God had been waiting too, waiting until they were ready to bear the truth. Her daughter looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, the mother who had carried sorrow like a shield, now speaking of hope with trembling lips, and something in her hardened stance broke, her shoulders slumping, her tears spilling free. She whispered that if he was lying, it would destroy them, and Nora pressed her forehead to her daughter's temple and said they had lived in ruin long enough, that it was time to risk something more than survival. The cowboy did not step closer, did not reach out. He only waited, his patience like a wall stronger than stone, and finally the daughter gave a small nod, not full trust but the first step toward it, and she turned away into the cabin with her face buried in her hands. Nora remained, her eyes fixed on him, and with a slow breath she moved aside from the doorway, opening the space wider, her voice low but steady as she said, if he meant his vow, if the box was truth and not trick, then he would prove it not by roses at the Cottonwood but by staying when the storms came. His eyes glistened with something fierce and quiet, and he stepped across the threshold, the weight of 20 winters lifting as the door that had kept them apart swung open not just to him, but to the life they might yet build. The cabin felt smaller with him inside, though he carried no threat, only the quiet weight of a man who had lived too long outdoors, and now stood uncertain under a roof that smelled of wood smoke and bread. Nora set the box on the table, its cracked lid catching the lamplight, and for a moment none of them spoke. The daughter curled on the bench with her arms folded tight, her eyes red but unyielding, while the cowboy stood with his hat in his hands, as though afraid to claim more space than he deserved. Nora's hands trembled as she brushed dust from the lid, her voice breaking when she said she had not opened it since the day she buried it, that she had carried the memory like a shame she never meant for anyone to see. The cowboy's gaze softened, and he said he had opened it only once, the night it saved his life, and afterward he never dared again, keeping it sealed as if to honor the prayer within. At that, her daughter's head snapped up, suspicion sharpening again, and she asked if he remembered what was written, daring him to prove he spoke truth. He hesitated only long enough to swallow, then said 3 words in a voice so steady it made Nora's chest ache. "Please don't forget." The girl blinked, her anger faltering, because the words matched her mother's clumsy scrawl, words she herself had never known. And though doubt still clung to her, the certainty in his tone cracked her mistrust. Nora covered her face with her hands, the tears spilling fast, because she had written them in desperation, thinking they vanished into earth. And yet those same words had carried him through 2 decades of hunger, storms, and solitude. The cowboy stepped closer, his voice low but certain, and he said he had not forgotten, not her, not the prayer, not the vow it had carved into him. And that was why he was here now. Her daughter's lip trembled, her fire not gone but shaken, and she whispered that if those words had kept him alive, then maybe they had been meant for more than him alone. Maybe they had been meant for all of them, and though she did not say forgiveness, her shoulders eased as if laying down a piece of the weight. Nora reached across the table, her fingers brushing the box, and she whispered that she had thought her prayer had been ignored, that she had buried it because faith felt too heavy to carry. And yet here it was, returned to her porch, by the very life it had saved. The cowboy lowered himself into the chair opposite her, slow and deliberate, as though marking the moment not as conquest but as covenant, and when he spoke again, his words were not a plea but a promise, that he would not stand outside their door again, that if they allowed him, he would share their winters, not as a ghost in the shadows but as a man who had come home. The fire popped in the hearth, the lamp flickered, and for the first time in years Nora felt the silence in her cabin shift, not empty but full, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew the box on the table was no longer just a relic of desperation, but the beginning of something she had not dared believe she would ever have again. The next morning dawned pale, snow still clinging to the fence posts, and Nora moved through her kitchen with a weight in her chest that felt both lighter and heavier at once. Lighter because the truth had stepped inside her door, heavier because she feared it might vanish as suddenly as it came. The cowboy was already awake, sitting near the fire with his hat resting on his knee, his presence steady, as if he had always belonged there, though the daughter lingered on the stairs with wary eyes, unwilling to grant him the comfort of trust. Nora set the kettle to boil and found herself glancing at the porch through the frost-fogged glass, expecting out of habit to see a rose laid against the gate. But of course it wasn't there, and the absence struck her like a bell, reminding her that the ritual of waiting had ended, replaced now by something less fragile and far more dangerous. Life lived face to face. She carried bread to the table, her hands trembling as she set it down, and her daughter whispered bitterly that roses wilt but lies last longer. The words sharp, though her voice cracked with the ache of someone desperate to believe otherwise. The cowboy did not flinch, only looked at the girl with eyes steady as stone, and he said he had left roses because he had no right to leave more, that they were not gifts but vows. And now the vow was not at the gate but in this room, at this table, where it belonged. Nora's chest tightened as she sat across from him, the box still between them like a judge of truth, and she asked what he had carried in his life, besides her prayer, What weight had shaped him into the man before her now? His voice lowered, rough with memory, and he told them of years wandering ranch to ranch, battles fought for men who never knew his name, nights hungry enough to carve pain into his bones, but always with the box beside him, always with her scrawled words pressing him forward until he began to believe that survival was not his alone, but something he owed to her. The daughter's eyes softened for a breath, then hardened again, asking why, if he owed her so much, he had not come sooner, not spoken before loneliness carved their lives hollow. His jaw worked, and he answered simply that he had feared her door would stay shut, that he had no right to force her hand, that love uninvited is only intrusion. Nora felt her throat burn because she knew the truth of it. She had kept the door bolted with grief. And yet she wanted to shout that he should have tried, should have broken through her silence. But when she looked at him, at the man weathered by years, yet still carrying patience like a shield, she understood that if he had come before she was ready, she would have turned him away, and the prayer that had saved him might have been lost to them both. The kettle whistled shrill, breaking the silence, and she poured 3 cups, her hands steady now, and when she placed one before him, it felt like a vow of her own. Her daughter's eyes darted between them, suspicion warring with something softer, and Nora knew the fight was not over, but the absence of a rose at the gate was no longer a wound. It was a promise that what mattered had stepped inside, no longer hidden, no longer waiting. The days that followed settled into a rhythm uneasy but alive, the cowboy working beside the cabin as though each chore was a way of proving his words, mending fences, chopping wood, carrying water without being asked, while Nora watched him with a heart torn between awe and fear, her hands trembling when she found herself humming again at the stove, a sound she had not made in years. Yet her daughter's eyes never left him, suspicion sharp as glass, her young face set in a mask of defiance. And one evening as the sun bled red across the horizon, she finally spoke the words that had been burning since the night he came. Telling him that patience and roses were easy when distance kept them safe, but now he would have to prove himself in the open, where work and danger and loyalty demanded more than gestures. He looked at her steadily, no anger in his gaze, and asked what proof she wanted, and she lifted her chin with a challenge too heavy for her years, saying there was a broken well at the far pasture, a place men called cursed, because no one had managed to draw clean water from it in a decade, and if he could bring them a bucket filled clear, she would believe he had come not to haunt their lives, but to mend them. Nora tried to hush her, fear tightening her chest, but the girl would not be silenced. Her voice shaking as she said men always promised and left, and she would not let her mother's heart be broken again without a fight. The cowboy listened, then rose slowly, setting his hat back on his head, and said he would go at first light, not because he needed to prove himself, but because faith is earned where doubt is heaviest. That night Nora lay awake, the box on the shelf beside her, her daughter sleeping restless in the loft, and she prayed that the past would not repeat itself, that hope would not once more turn to ashes. When dawn came, she found him already saddling his horse, the frost biting his breath. And though she begged him not to go, he only smiled faintly and said she had asked him once why he never knocked, and the answer was the same now, because doors, like hearts, had to be opened from within. Then he rode out toward the far pasture, the figure of a man against the rising sun, and Nora clutched the porch rail until her knuckles bled white, knowing that this was no longer about a rose left at her gate, but about whether love could survive when put to the hardest test. The pasture stretched wide and silent, frost clinging to the tall grass, and the well sat crooked at its heart like an old scar on the land, its stones cracked, its rope frayed, the wood cover half rotted from years of neglect. The cowboy dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the earth, and stood staring at it as if he were looking at more than broken stone, as if he saw the weight of the girl's doubt and the years of silence that had brought him here. He looped the reins around a post and pulled the rope, feeling it strain and creak as if protesting his touch. And when the bucket dropped, it splashed into darkness that smelled of rust and mud. He heaved it up, his arms flexing with the effort, but when he tipped it into the trough, only brown water spilled, foul and useless, and he could almost hear the girl's voice in his head, sharp with suspicion, warning that he was no different from the others who promised and failed. He set his jaw, lowering the bucket again, pulling it up with persistence that had carved his life for 20 years, and still the water ran murky, spilling through his fingers like ash. Sweat cut through the cold on his brow, his breath ragged, and for a moment doubt gnawed at him. Maybe she was right, maybe waiting, and roses were easier than proving himself under the weight of expectation. But then his hand brushed the pocket where he kept the scrap of her old note. The childish scrawl faded but still legible. "Please don't forget." He closed his fist around it, whispering to the air that he would not forget. Not her, not the vow. And with renewed strength he leaned into the rope, pulling until the fibers groaned. The bucket emerged heavy, water sloshing, and this time when he poured it into his palm it ran clear, cold, and pure, the first clean water drawn in a decade. He laughed, a low sound torn from his chest, not in triumph, but in relief, and filled the trough until it brimmed with clarity that sparkled in the morning sun. When he rode back toward the cabin, the bucket tied secure, his heart carried more than proof. It carried the knowledge that patience alone was no longer enough, that love had to work, sweat, and bleed in the light of day. Nora saw him crest the ridge and ran to the porch, her breath catching when she saw the water spill clear across the bucket's rim, and her daughter, standing behind her, froze with wide eyes, the fight in her face crumbling into something she had never shown him before. Hope. He set the bucket on the steps, his shoulders heaving, his face streaked with sweat and frost, and said nothing, only waited. And when the girl stepped forward, her hand trembling as she dipped her fingers into the water and brought them to her lips, she whispered that it tasted like truth. The clear water in the bucket glistened like glass beneath the sun, and for a long moment no one moved, as if the land itself held its breath at the sight of something that had defied a decade of failure. Nora's daughter stared into the bucket, her fingers still damp against her lips, her throat working as she swallowed the truth she could no longer deny, and her eyes lifted to the cowboy with a look stripped of suspicion, but heavy with the fear of believing. She whispered that men always came with hands full of promises and left with hands empty. But this water was different because it asked for nothing. It simply was. Clear and unarguable. The cowboy did not answer with words, only nodded once, as if acknowledging that the test had never been about the well, but about whether he would stand when asked to prove himself, and Nora felt her chest tremble with pride and sorrow all at once, because she saw in her daughter's face the same shift she had once fought herself. The slow crumbling of walls built too high against hope. The girl stepped back, her tears hot and unashamed, and told him if he meant to stay, then he must never let silence grow between them again, never let 20 winters pass without truth spoken, and her voice shook with the rawness of demand, but also with the tenderness of trust trying to be born. He knelt, setting his hat aside, meeting her at eye level, his voice steady as he promised that silence would never again be his gift, that if she asked for words, for proof, for presence, he would give it, not only for her mother but for her too, because family was not chosen by blood alone, but by the vow to remain. Nora's heart ached as she watched her daughter, her eyes softening, her hands twisting in her dress before she stepped forward and pressed the tips of her fingers into his scarred palm. Not fully trust, not yet forgiveness, but a beginning. The cowboy's hand closed gently around hers, and the sight made Nora's tears fall, because for the first time since he arrived, the space between them no longer felt divided. That night the bucket still sat on the porch, gleaming in the moonlight like a testament carved from labor and faith. And as Nora stood at the window watching the steam curl from his coffee, she knew the walls around their hearts had begun to crack. Not in ruin, but in renewal. And what seeped through them was not weakness, but the strength of love, finally given room to breathe. Spring thaw loosened the earth, and one evening when the sky burned with the last gold of day, Nora walked with him and her daughter back to the cottonwood tree, where it had all begun. The roots sprawled wide, gnarled and heavy, the ground still marked by the place where her small hands had once dug in desperation, and she felt the years collapse into a single moment. The child she had been kneeling in the snow, the woman she had become watching a cowboy place her prayer back in her hands. Her daughter stood between them, the wind teasing her hair, her eyes searching the tree as though she might see in its bark the story of the box that had bound their lives together. The cowboy touched the trunk with his palm, his voice low as he said that this tree had been witness to their vow, that it had sheltered the prayer of a girl and given a starving boy the reason to live, and now it would stand as the place where their lives truly began again. Nora's chest tightened, her throat thick as she whispered that she had asked God not to forget her, and he had answered not with thunder or miracle, but with patience, 20 winters of roses, and a man who had carried her words across decades. Her daughter took her hand, and for the first time, there was no resistance in her grip, only trust as she turned to the cowboy and told him if the tree had been their beginning, then it should also be their promise, that whatever storms came, they would not bury their hopes again, but face them together. His eyes shone, and he reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a single rose, fresh and crimson, the last one he would ever leave at her gate, and he set it gently at the roots where the box had once been, his voice steady as he said that waiting was over and living had begun. Nora's tears spilled freely as she leaned into him, the warmth of his arm wrapping around her, her daughter pressed close at her side, and for the first time, the cottonwood did not feel like a grave of forgotten prayers, but a living witness to answered ones. The wind stirred through its branches, scattering blossoms across their shoulders like blessings, and as the sun sank behind the ridge, Nora knew the door to her heart would never close again. Not while the tree stood, and not while the man who carried her vow lived to keep it. The rose at the roots glowed red against the darkening earth, and she whispered that she was no longer forgotten, that she was finally found. And in that moment, the three of them turned toward home, the cabin waiting with its firelight spilling from the door left wide open, a symbol no winter could shut again.